Go ahead and get started. People may still wander in with that cup of coffee or tea that they were waiting for. And folks online, if you don't have your name on your box, if you would drop names in the chat so you can get to know each other there too. If you haven't already introduced yourself at your table, please do so, but it looked like people were doing that as they came in. I'm Karen Marie Eust, my colleague Erin Reibel. We are the Director and Associate Director of the Children's Spirituality Research and Innovation Hub at Union Presbyterian Seminary. And we are very grateful to the Lilly Endowment for their $4.6 million that they have let us be spending and still spend on children's spirituality, looking at resources and research for children 12 and younger and their families, which is not always the focus. Usually the youth get all the good money. So we're excited about that. Today, we want to talk about neurospicy kids and families and spiritual practices that would go with them. We're going to sort of do this where for a good part of the session, I'll be facilitating in the room and Erin will be facilitating online, but there will come a point when we're going to do a bit of a swap to share some of the resources with you. In the center of your table, there should be a copy of the spiritual practices for neurospicy kids and families. Please feel free to take one of those, and we'll be using those later. In case I forget to say it, if we have others left on tables and you want more than one copy, please feel free to take them. Also, you can email us and ask for more copies of this or any other resource we have. We give them to you for free and we ship for free, even to Canada. Although sometimes getting them across the border is a bit of a challenge, but we get it there. Please know that you have that flexibility because I can see we've got ones left on the table. All right, so let me start today by talking a little bit about what is neurodiversity. And if you're in the room, you probably already have some sense of this because of your interest, but we are coming from the perspective that neurodiversity is natural variations in brain activity and cognitive processing. And if we really get a whole group of people together, we could call it a neurodiverse group, even if there aren't any particular diagnoses that would be associated with someone being labeled neurodiverse in some way. So neurodiversity is really an umbrella term. It acknowledges that some people's brains receive and process information differently than others. And I would say actually many of our brains process differently. It's just some of them we consider normative, sort of normal variations, and others we feel like are there further outside of what we're going to find or could be commonplace. Children who have been diagnosed with conditions such as ADHD, autism, dyslexia, bipolar disorder, all of them would be considered neurodiverse under this umbrella term. And affirming neurodiversity really relies or focuses on understanding that these differences are variations in how the brain functions rather than deficits in brain function. And yet we live in cultures and societies where that's not necessarily how people look at it. Some people look at a different way of thinking as a deficit that then needs to be somehow corrected rather than built upon in a way that, a sort of different way that you can build on and work with. So the approach we're taking then is that these different ways of cognitively functioning either fall more within the dominant social standards and therefore they're considered neurotypical, or they fall outside of whatever the cultural standards are at the moment and they're thought of as neurodiverse. Then in addition to some of these kinds of things, I would also say, although we're not focusing as much on this age group, that adults or other persons who have various forms of dementia related to aging would also be thought of as neurodiverse because their cognition is shifting and working differently. In the same way, if you take certain kinds of medication, it can have long-term effects on cognitive functioning, or it can dampen certain forms. And so that's another form of neurodiversity, if we're just thinking about this as an umbrella term. And you'll see on this ring that there's all kinds of things, including depression, clinical depression, which changes the way that the brain works. Being gifted in the various ways that that gets assessed is also another way. My eldest child in the 5th grade taught herself 3 different computer coding languages from library books. My brain can't and didn't do that. That child is now a a major player in Google. And so that worked really well. But that we often don't think of giftedness as neurodiversity, and yet it falls there. Those who've experienced significant trauma, their brains change and process in different ways because of that. So when we think of neurodiversity, we need to think way more broadly than just certain childhood diagnoses. We think, and I imagine many of you in the room, if not all, think that it's important to resist the disability label when we're talking about neurodiversity. And I recognize that oftentimes in public schooling systems in particular, funding is attached to disability labels, so there's going to be ways in which that happens, that in order to get the services that one needs, the same thing for getting access to various federal or state or local funded social services programs. At the same time, just because it's a diagnosis and a label that then gives access is sort of key to that doesn't mean that we then need to pick up and reinforce that labeling sort of piece. Any more than we would want to do that in terms of the labels we give children as the quiet one, or the active one, or the sporty one, that tends to limit children's options because they have to sort of live up to their labels or live into their labels. So with neurodivergent children, they're bringing their own set of strengths and challenges to a family or to a congregation, even though that may look like a learning difference because it doesn't fit neatly into the way we wanted to proceed. For example, kids who are diagnosed with ADHD may be really high energy learners. And they may lack some strong executive functioning skills, but they are also going to go gung-ho into a lesson or into a family activity in ways that we could celebrate, even if it is a little exhausting. Because if we're not high energy learning in that way, we struggle to keep up. Or kids who are diagnosed on the autism spectrum may be very detail-oriented and excellent memorizers, but they also struggle to follow group discussions. So they're going to be good at some of the kinds of activities that we might do, and they're going to struggle with others in the way that every child does. There are those kids who sort of classically seem to be able to do all the things that we usually put into place, but most kids have strengths and weaknesses when it comes to their learning and orientations. And the same is true of kids that we think of as neurodivergent. We then want to have teaching and learning models that encourage all children to tap into their strengths. And we want to communicate that divergent thinking and divergent engagement in learning is valued. And the way to do that then is to have this kind of attentiveness to what those strengths might be and then play into those strengths. Again, across different strengths means we have to have different kinds of activities in a family or in a Sunday school. And we have to recognize that not everybody's going to engage at the same level because of those preferences and strengths. And it needs to be okay that not every kid wants to do everything at the same level of engagement or enthusiasm. We also need to provide support for all children because this is how we communicate care. And so when a child struggles to follow a group conversation, then encouraging everyone to slow down and to restate if asked, to recognize that the questioning is not to be difficult, but in order to make sense out of, and to normalize those kinds of things in our group, that we're going to take each piece as an authentic need to engage rather than as interrupting. Or we're going to have learners who need to move around the room. And so we're going to actually set up for that, and we're going to learn how we can engage those who are walking the perimeter as well as those who are sitting quietly, rather than expecting crisscross applesauce out of everybody. So it's looking for those ways, and to think of this as a way of being caring rather than crowd control. And I've spent 11 years in pastoral ministry, and the most popular thing that my Sunday school teachers wanted me to do was to teach them how to manage the classroom, which really meant how do I get all the kids to conform to a certain sort of normative, we're all going to sit in a circle and be quiet. I instead took all the chairs out of the room and said, we're going to move and be standing and doing things, and that will actually take care of that problem because nobody's going to be sitting quietly in a circle. But it was a learning process as we engaged in that. So we tend to prefer certain strengths because they make our jobs easier as teachers and Christian educators, ministers, parents. But in reality, that often asks the child to kind of figure out how to fit into a norm that really they rub against in some ways. So resisting diversity labels becomes a really important piece. The other thing that it's helpful to do, and again, many of you in this room have probably already begun to engage these kind of things, is to learn more about neurospicy needs. And so there are studies that are done, often with a little bit older group than the age group that we at the Hub tend to focus on, but my reading of the developmental and educational psychology research suggests that these things are true for other age groups as well. But the research that I'm drawing from here actually is a pretty large study of neurodivergent students at the college level and their ability to sort of articulate what they've learned about how they need to learn. That again appears to also be appropriate for younger children too. So one of the things that they have said is that they need specific and clear instructions. So lay out what are the steps to what we're going to do, or how is the day going to unfold, or the learning period going to unfold. What is the family routine? And to be able to provide those specific and clear instructions so they can use them as a step-by-step guide for moving through something. That tends to be a need that many neurospicy kids have. Flexibility for self-guided learning. What that really means is when we're engaging in an activity, say in a church school setting or in worship, leaving some space for people to enter it and engage with it in their own way. So instead of everybody has to do it sort of lockstep, there's some space for that. That can be as simple as allowing for people to draw as well as write, as well as say something out loud. So there's these options, and they're all affirmed as being welcome, rather than we're all supposed to just speak it aloud. We kind of do this when we say, you can think or say aloud your prayer request, like we're already offering that option, and we do it because we know some people will never speak a prayer request out loud. But we really want them to speak it out loud, and often the way we give that instruction implies that we really want it out loud, but only if you won't do that should you think it in your head. This flexibility means we have to really mean it. And maybe we even need to model some of the ways that would not be our preference in order that others see that it truly is an option there. Alongside the flexibility is choices among activities and steps. So it may not be a linear pathway. It might mean that it's an if-then. So you get to this and then you have this choice or that choice, and then depending upon which choice you make, you have other choices. So we might have more of that grid that can go there. But again, it's largely about children being able to assert some control, but also clearly knowing what the social expectations are so that they can navigate with those two pieces through whatever it is that a family or a congregation is trying to do. Visuals and graphics are helpful for many kids who are neurodivergent. Their brain is able to take what they are hearing and put it with what they're seeing and come up with a fuller picture. That's actually true of a lot of learners. Is that it's so much easier if there's an icon. Oh, marketers know this so well. If there's an icon or a symbol that you attach to a jingle or some other kind of piece, and how much easier it is to remember that. And all the things that it also evokes. So again, think about the various kind of icons, like a Nike swoop. You see that and you think your brain populates that with all other kinds of associations. That's part of what visual graphic kinds of elements provide for people, is a way to bring other pieces in. Even colors, particularly in the way that we associate certain colors with certain kinds of emotions, And that varies somewhat from people to people, but there are sort of generalizable pieces of that. Blue is calming, and so seeing something in a blue tone also suggests something about the emotional tenor of that activity. Red is exciting or anger, or it's jazzy. It's going to energize. So you see something in red and you feel like you need to do something. And again, those are sort of taught connections that we pick up when we're really even very young. So the visuals and graphics. Opportunities to be creative, to be able to think outside the box, which is really neurodivergency the box is the neurotypical norms. So neurodivergent kids are thinking outside the box all the time, but are we giving them permission to bring that out of the box thinking into whatever it is that we're doing, and to invite the rest of us to be in that space with them? That's sort of the opportunity to be creative. Clear and logical applications. I had a seminary student who was diagnosed with high-functioning autism, and she made it clear to me, because she would come to my office after class every day to sort of check her understanding of different things, that I used a lot of metaphors. And metaphors are not clear and logical. In fact, they're designed not to be. Parables. When you tell a parable, it is not logical. And it wasn't intended to be. But for someone whose brain wants to make a clear, logical progression of ideas, that's just very confusing speech. And I had no idea that I used so many metaphors and similes in my class lectures till she would come in having noted each one and would want me to explain them. And it taught me to sort of use a combination of, if I use a metaphor, I also need to provide a logical definition or explanation alongside it. It wasn't that I couldn't use metaphors. I needed to then provide the secondary piece. So think about how often you use, faith is like a mustard seed. What else could you say about faith that is more logical than that particular thing? So that, again, all the learners in the room are actually going to benefit from that kind of parallel or multiplying of applications. Sensory stimuli that focus on specific tests. Many persons who are neurodivergent have different ways of relating to sensory stimulation than, again, our normative, you should be able to screen that out, or you shouldn't need to have this support. So offering space for those sensory stimuli, and you'll see some of that when we get into the practices that we're doing. Encouraging the use of other senses in the space, but also recognizing that some senses are so highly stimulating for some persons that might not be the way, that they need to moderate it. They may need to wear earplugs to dampen sound. They may not enjoy touching certain kind of textures, and so don't want to engage that way. Or they may need to be able to touch certain textures to help calm themselves. And fidget toys and tools have become also a piece of that. The use of a certain kind of repetitive stimuli to help stay focused. And then clear social expectations. The most common way that this happens, and you may be already doing this in a lot of spaces, certainly happens in a lot of youth groups, is the creating of a group covenant, where we set down through conversation what our ways of being together are going to be and how it is that we'll respond when a problem develops. For many children who are neurodivergent, social expectations and social cues are a bit opaque. And so they need that clearer sense, and they may also need to be able to express why certain expectations don't make sense. So that negotiating part is also really important, because if they're not able to say, but I don't understand why that would be something we do, or why wouldn't we do it this way? That seems more logical. And again, because our social covenants also are very neurotypical in the ways we assume, making eye contact. In the US, in North America, and many European societies, that's considered a sign of respect and engagement. But if making eye contact is not a comfortable way, and other ways of doing it, like speaking about, but looking sort of over the shoulder or looking down, then we don't want a covenant that says that if you're not making eye contact, you're not being present with one another. What are other ways we can show being present? And there we may need to rely on neurodivergent children to tell us what it is that signals their presence in that space. Now keep in mind, this is a composite list, so not every child has all of these needs, but this is the sorts of things that we might want to be ruminating over as we're structuring things. The other piece is to think about neurodivergence as a kind of complementary cognition. That again, we tend to look at what is it that's not typical, and then try to attend to that. We don't always look at what is it that they really bring in abundance to the space that really complements the other ways that we do things. So ADHD brings a larger openness to creativity, brings hyper-focus sometimes, which is really engaging. We also see that with some children on the autism spectrum being hyper-focused and attentive to certain kinds of details or themes. And energy and passion at a level that sometimes I certainly wish I had for something. Someone who has mental health struggles in our diagnoses often brings a kind of depth of thinking about things that we don't normally see in children. And so they're really thinking through all the implications of something. And their struggle may be not going down that hole so deeply that they can't figure out how to move themselves out, but that skill, when redirected into sort of constructive engagement, is an amazing sort of analytical ability. Some folks who have learning difficulties like dyslexia have other forms of engagement with other ways of engaging. Sorry, I'm also tired. Of course they have other ways of engaging if they have other ways of engaging. If they're struggling to read letters, they may be, however, picking up on social cues more strongly. And so we see these different kinds of things. Those who struggle with mathematical things often have very strong verbal skills, like those things are often paired. So learning something about it, again, this sort of diagram provides some of the sort of typical findings around those complementary cognition skills, but looking at a strengths-based approach. What is it that this person's bringing that's a strength to the group, and how can we then encourage them to use that strength as a part of the group or the family setting, and focusing less on the what is it they aren't bringing, at least in terms of our norms. So we really want to have this strengths-based approach. And that's then what we've tried to bring to this resource that you have, which we worked with Becca Richardson, an innovator who had this idea. She's in Minnesota at Shepherd of the Lake Lutheran Church, and she's worked with a lot of special education students. She herself also has a child who's on the autism spectrum, and she was really interested in trying to think about how we take all these principles that we know and imagine spiritual kinds of practices. So we developed this resource that has 6 different spiritual kinds of practices. And we wanted to talk about some of those, and then also we'll have you trying some of the practices here. I'm actually going to start with the last one in your deck of cards, which is the one about, where's my that? Visits with friends and family. And again, these practices don't necessarily have to be used in the ways that we have put them here, but they are often useful practices in that particular circumstance. Here we used an approach that's called a social story. And social stories are sort of scripts that are created to help children who struggle with making social connections anticipate and plan the kind of responses that they want to make. They're often created with children, if children are able to participate in that kind of way. They can also be created by an adult who knows the child and can help fill in the blanks. But they use descriptive kinds of statements. Here's what could happen, or here's where we're going. They provide perspective. Here's something that might become an issue or present an opportunity. They have directive statements. Here's what I want to do in this case. And they have affirmative sentences. Here's why that action will help me feel the way I want to feel about what's going on. So you're anticipating then these scenarios and you're preparing for them. Social stories are really looking to present the kind of basic emotional and behavioral information that a child needs clearly and step by step. So each sentence is moving into an interaction in that way. So for example, if a child is struggling to use their words rather than throw a tantrum when someone does something that they don't like, a social story can walk them through the steps they need to manage their emotions differently in a way that they will be happier to have used. It offers simple actions like taking a deep breath, or doing a feeling scan, or telling the other person about their feelings and providing some of those cues. Because they need to break down situations into manageable parts, social stories are also empowering children to self-regulate, because now they can see the parts and they can imagine moving from one part to the next. So it helps them understand what might happen, but also helps them assert a certain amount of control and to make choices in that process of control. And as they feel that they have more control, then they're more confident about how they're going to interact. So if there is a behavioral covenant in a group and a child is struggling with some part of that behavior covenant, a social story can be used to sort of practice that engagement ahead of time. Social stories also build empathy by providing information about other people's needs and other people's emotions. And empathy can be a difficult thing to cultivate if you're having trouble with social cues, because it's hard to put oneself in the shoes of the other person if your brain doesn't tend to think in terms of that kind of executive function shift or theory of mind sort of engagements. So here is informationally, one can remember that this is how a person likely will feel if this happens, even if one doesn't actually experience the sense of being in the other person's shoes. So building statements like, others may get upset if I yell at them. That's a sort of cause and effect fact. Or my friends prefer that we take turns when we play. That's just a knowledge bit that one can have. And it helps children sort of recognize those interpersonal expectations between family members, between friends, between acquaintances. So we use a social story practice to help children prepare for visits with friends, with extended family members. Essentially, when a child is taken out of their usual routine and their usual spaces and now has to try to function in someone else's kind of space to do that. And so you'll see, then I've put one up here. Here's an example of a social story that uses visual cues as well as written cues. And with children who, again, are comfortable engaging this, you can write the story in words but ask them to illustrate it. And you can use a computer to be able to get the kinds of illustrations that you want, or you can hand draw. Some social stories are actually books where each step is on a page in some way. So this one was about, sometimes I get really frustrated and mad. That's one of those descriptive things. I want to throw things, hit people, yell and cry. If I act that way, I can get in trouble and people don't want to be my friend. When I'm frustrated, I need to take a deep breath. That's one of those directive. Here's what I need to do. I can ask for a break, take a walk, get a drink of water, or put my head down. I tell people around me, I am frustrated right now. I use my words. Soon I will feel better, that affirmation. Now, this story actually offers many options. With younger children, you may just want to figure out the option that seems most doable to them, and that's the option that they have. So we've provided you with, and families with, a story script to fill in the blanks. It's time to go on a visit with whomever. Sometimes I get blank when I think about going on a visit because this is what is going on. I can do a body scan to check how my body is feeling. I'm going to do that now. And then pause to do that. We're on our way. When I see my friend or family member, name could be in there, I want to greet them. I do so by, here's what I'm going to do. We start to spend time together. I want to let my friend or family member know that I like being together. I do so by, so again, how will you show this? While we are together, my friend or family member does something I don't like. And if you actually know that there are certain things that tend to happen, that could get more particular. When I am with so-and-so, they might do this. I can let my friend or family member know how I feel by this or this. I want my actions to help my friend or family member know me better. Again, that might change. You might want to rephrase that one if there's a different thing that's wanted, but that's a common one. I also want my friend or family member to know that I care about them. I choose to do blank because this is what it will communicate. I feel more relaxed around my friend or family member when I share what I am thinking. So it's this working through of that. Notice that we've not included a lot of explicit God language here. And you certainly could create a story that has more of that. But, well, I shouldn't say but, and that idea of God or Jesus being with you is a little metaphorical. And so often not as helpful as we think it would be. But if a child has that as a part of the kind of normative language around them, then they may have adopted it as a piece of that, and it could certainly be added in. We take the perspective at the Spirituality Hub that connecting with self, with others, with the world, and with God as the transcendent in our world, that those are forms of spirituality that just don't have the layer of religious language over them. So this practice is about connecting with self and connecting with others in some very strong ways. And that's why we call it a spiritual practice. But you could add explicit religious language, or you could offer a prayer before or after. You could, if that feels more comfortable, or if you're in an explicitly religious space and want to help children see the connection between faith and this. Let me just pause here to see if you have any questions about what we've been saying so far, and then Erin and I are going to swap spaces, and she's going to talk you through and have you, in fact, do a couple of the other practices. Questions or comments? And yes, we're going to use a mic for the folks online.
It seems to me, or at least my experience has been, that different kiddos, and perhaps this is age-related and maybe not age-related, need social stories of different lengths. That even that kind of 6-step thing you have there might be too many steps for some kiddos, and so you have to kind of adapt it, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think that's true, and it's hard to say age-wise, because if you've ever read a storybook to a 3-year-old, some 3-year-olds like really long stories and can even listen to, and we have research that shows that it's valuable to listen to chapter books that that aren't picture books. Other 3-year-olds aren't at all engaged with it. Other 9-year-olds aren't engaged with that. So yes, know the child and whittle it down. But even something that just has the first part of the story, or that jumps to the I'm with my friend, like this one is actually in some ways shorter because it's taking on the more general piece. So you could just do that, I get frustrated when friend does this, I can do this other thing instead. I will feel better, I'll feel this way when I do that. That's like 3 steps. Agreed. Other comments and thoughts for this way?
Just way back at the beginning, can you share like a repeatable, easily explained definition of executive function? Because that's kind of like a buzzword now. We're seeing it with people saying, oh, I'm not executively functioning today. And when you're talking about, especially with parents that are just learning and trying to understand what, their kids' diagnoses are, Sometimes we just don't know.
Yes.
What would be a good way to define that?
So the very simplest way is executive function is about managing big emotions. And are you able to recognize the cues in yourself and then use tools or resources to manage those emotions so that you get what you want on the other side? Now, there are lots of other complex things in terms of being able, theory of mind has to do with being able to take another's perspective, and it's a part of executive function, and it's one of the parts that children on the autism spectrum in particular have difficulty doing, and developing. But by and large, I would say if we just think of executive function as managing your big emotions constructively, that will cover a lot.
To the story script.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, and maybe I just missed something or misunderstood, but is this done with in some settings it could be done in writing for them to write and then you would share it verbally, or are we imagining that it's all verbalized with one another so that there's like a practice of how that's going to happen?
So typically a social story is written out using pictures and words, or at least words and words and pictures, and then you read it like a story. So it becomes, interestingly, I would say, especially in the sort of preschool years, there are a lot of books for children that already are quasi-social stories. They're just depersonalized. So, Franklin the Turtle books. There's a whole lot of Franklin the Turtle books that are about how to deal with particular kinds of situations. They're kind of like social stories, and if you put yourself in Franklin's place, you're kind of learning along with Franklin to do that. And because it's hard to put oneself in that other place, neurodiverse children may not see themselves in Franklin's place and recognize that this story also is about them in the same way that another child might more easily put themselves in that space. So this personalizes the story, and also because it has it's their name or their event, they recognize that this is them. But yeah, it's that way.
Bouncing off of that, a lot of parents do a social story naturally before going into a store. In the car, you rehearse what to expect. And so if it helps to think about, we're talking through what to expect, that's a social story. Yeah. So you've already created a mental image for the kid, and that makes you able to use recall rather than having to rely on the book to walk them through.
That's true. Well, and I think we do that with all children often. Now remember, when we get out of the car, you're going to hold my hand, and we're going to cross the parking lot, and when we get into the store, you're going to sit in the cart, and we can't touch the things on the shelves, or you're going to get your little cart, and you're going to get the mac and cheese and the soup, and so we actually tend to do this. My middle daughter is a developmental psychologist, teaches at Dickinson College down the Turnpike, and she was talking about how this is actually the best thing you can do for a brand new infant. She has a 2-week-old today, and you narrate what you're doing. So the social story just takes that another step further, and it identifies those pinch points that are difficult for the child. And then it narrates a story that helps them manage or deal with those pinch points that keep coming up. So if you've done that, before the store, but every single time some piece of that keeps failing, then a social story can explicitly try to address that place, so it's done differently. And for a child who's really struggling with the part you can't know, which is the person who comes up and starts trying to engage them, and that is overwhelming, that part of the story wouldn't naturally come in the car. So it's trying to also look at those places where it would fall apart. But just narrating what's going to happen and what we might do and how that we'll feel about that actually should be something we're doing with kids, period, in terms of developing their language skills, but also in developing their executive functions.
So, the other thing to add here about social stories is it's being intentional about this process. And one of the challenges perhaps of doing that right in the car is that you've got a child who's already overwhelmed and stressed about the transition from moving from home to car to store. And so when you're able to practice these things ahead of time with the social story, you've read it, you know, the night before, the day before, it becomes part of their habit, then it makes that transition a little bit more smooth.
All right, I think we're going to move into our next one. Come on, why are you not moving? There we go. So we're going to swap off.
So we're going to be looking at the getting ready for school or preschool practice here. One of the things with children who are neurodiverse is that struggle with transitions and that nervousness that can sort of build. What the science would tell us is that big body movements can help us regulate. So this practice is a body movement practice to help with those big emotions that are happening for a child who may not be able to manage that because of these executive function skills. So what we're going to do is we're going to do this practice all together. So I would invite you to go ahead and stand up and do this practice with me. Let's try meditating with our whole bodies. I will lead, and you can follow me like follow the leader. Let's breathe in slowly and feel the air move in our bodies. Now let's breathe out slowly and feel the air move out of our bodies. Sometimes we feel stressed and overwhelmed. Things feel all out of control. Sometimes we want to hide. But then we decide to take action. We'll find the strength to move forward. And we are ready for the day. I'm going to do it again. Sometimes we feel stressed and overwhelmed. Sometimes we want to hide. But then we decide to take action. So we'll find the strength to move forward. And we are ready for the day. Do it one more time. Sometimes we feel stressed and overwhelmed. Things feel out of control. Sometimes we want to hide. But then we decide to take action. We find the strength to move forward, and we are ready for the day. Thank you. You can sit down. So you can see those big movements help us regulate our emotions, help us to go into the day. And our idea with these is that they become practices, right? That this could be something that becomes part of the practice of going to school, part of the practice of getting ready to leave the house. Let's see, the next one we're going to look at is the sensory mindfulness. So this is a mealtime practice. Many of our neurodiverse kids really struggle with the sensory pieces around food. Particularly kids on the spectrum can have a lot of food sensory issues, a lot of sensitivities, and eating can be very stressful for everyone involved, but particularly for the kids. So this is a practice that we developed to really think about how to make that a little bit more mindful. It's not a practice about thinking about how to get the kid to eat any of these foods, but just a way to calm down the stress that can sometimes come with that. Again, I'm going to be the parent here, and if y'all will follow along as we do this practice together. All right, let's breathe slowly together. In and out, slowly together. Breathe in slowly. And breathe out slowly. Breathe in. Breathe out. All right. Let's name 3 things that we can touch and feel. Can someone tell me one? A pet? Alrighty. The chairs have that rubby fabric. Does someone have another one? Your shirt. All right. Let's name 3 things that we can hear. Air vent. I can hear the fan. My stomach growls. Your stomach growling. Alrighty. Let's name 3 colors we can see on our plates. Red, green, yellow. Let's take a few more deep breaths. Breathe in slowly. Breathe out slowly. Breathe in. And breathe out. So this practice is really building on moving from out to closer to the plate and noticing things around you. And many of you might have heard that practice, when you're trying to calm down from anxiety or being anxious, where you're looking at, you look for 5 things, you hear 5 things, 5 colors. So building off of that, specifically around this idea around food, since it can be such a challenging and anxiety-producing experience for many kids.
So both of these kinds of practices are also drawing on a sort of wider research realm that if we go back one, let me see here. We know that large body movements actually help us shift out of a sort of anxious mode into a different sort of space. And in fact, in one of our other resources on trauma and resiliency, we talk about a practice called shift and stay, which is a sort of basic in the trauma or community resiliency models sort of arena, where you recognize that you're sort of in one space and you make a choice to move to another, and then you use different sorts of activities, often movement-based, to help you physically move yourself. And then you think about that moving your emotion, and then shift and stay in that space. So there's a reason that those are big movements instead of small movements, because those big movements give us a sense of being in our body, like you notice your body more when you move big, and they also elicit a kind of connection to certain kind of emotions. When you get down, scrunched down small, you feel small, you feel scrunched, you feel held in. When you open that up, your body signals your brain to think, I'm opened up. So you're using those kind of emotions. So you could actually create other movements for other kinds of uses. We have a whole series of embodied prayers that is on our website, or we had USB drives with them here, and we can send them to folks. And they're all about eliciting, like we started with the movements. How do you feel if you do this? Like what kinds of feelings and what kinds of words might go to the feeling of moving your body like this in prayer? And so if you wanted to build on this idea of a movement practice, you could then take it to sort of any sort of place and think about what are the emotions that are going on. The child may be able to tell you that, or the child may not be able to articulate that, and then create a meditation that helps them shift and stay in another space. So we go from the anxious positions to the open positions to the energetic positions as a way to signal from the body to the brain that this is how we want to enter into school or preschool. but there are other sequences that you could then create for whatever it is that you're doing. Similarly to the way that, if any of you are familiar with godly play practices, they start with "Be still and know that I am God" as a way to do that sort of centering. They're using a song, but they're also using movement, some practitioners anyway. "Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know." Notice how it keeps bringing you back. The big becomes here, centered at you, and the stillness becomes, the emotions get smaller, the singing gets slower. All of that is cueing the body through the senses. So that's the principle underlying it in many ways, is we're using our bodies to cue our emotions. We're using that sensation of movement to signal what we want to do. So that's part of what's going on with the body meditation. And then, as Erin was saying, the sensory, it's not only further out and coming in, it's also, again, using our senses to focus our attention. So instead of focusing on "this is yucky, I don't want to eat it," it's what are these things you can see, what you can touch, what can you hear? So you, and that attentiveness to those things calms anxiety. Because when you focus attention, it takes all that sort of agitation that's just free floating, and you now have to sort of put it into paying attention to these things. So I can't, it's harder for me to have free-floating anxiety and notice the sounds. And so you're signaling that shift there too. I want to reiterate what Erin said. This is not about getting kids to eat better. It's about dealing with that lack of emotional regulation. And then other things that one might be working with various counselors and medical professionals around what needs to happen for nutrition, that is then going to accompany it. This is just about the sort of recentering that comes through attention and is coming off all of that sort of research. All right. Thoughts, questions, practices that you may have seen or have thought of as we're going along in this Let's Be Creative, a creative opportunity. Who would like to contribute?
Have an autistic child in our church who often needs the bodily responses to get body feedback. And so we've been relying on Old Testament wisdom of falling on our face before the Lord. And so we allow him to press his head into the floor, which gives him the sensory needs he has without it being dangerous for him or distracting for others. And it's been really useful for his family. They were pleasantly surprised. So.
Yeah.
I think one of the things to think about with neurodiverse kids, and this is why I love this practice and some of the other ones, is that they can't always identify what's going in their body. And so when you're able to do that with them, it's very helpful because they can't identify sometimes what the feeling, the sensation, but nor the feeling as well. So providing these opportunities gives that.
Yeah. And I would say as well, inviting other children to try the same thing to see what they experience. So it's not about this child's doing something strange. Yeah.
So it was all of us together.
Yeah. And so, but let's all try this and notice how we hear the story differently.
I didn't realize that something that we've been doing is sort of a version of sharing stories. I have teens that, like, the social anxiety of they despise coffee hour and hanging out with adults after church, and we're trying to encourage all the intergenerational interaction. But what they tell me in Sunday school is, I don't want to go down there because people are just going to ask me questions. How was school? What are you doing? Blah, 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 blah. Yeah. So we've been joking around.
Inquisition.
We've been joking around about, some of them are theater kids. So I'm like, well, let's workshop it. let's say like if you have an answer in your head or a question that you can ask back, would that make you feel better? So we've been like, and a lot of it is humorous and they come up with ridiculous things, but I didn't realize until just now that it's the same thing as working someone through a story. So we've been like workshopping how to have coffee hour chat with the old ladies that come up and say, well, where do you go to school and what do you like? And because a lot of times, like in our congregation, the adult's impression of the kids based on their interaction. And I just thought of just now, what if we talk to ourselves and our adults about how we're asking the questions?
Yeah, I'm wondering about a social story for the older women of the church here.
Where do you go to school? Did you get your driver's license yet? Like, what's your favorite class? Like, kids are like.
Yeah, absolutely. While you're thinking of other things you might want to say, the other 3 practices that we didn't try to experience with you, in part because a couple of them don't fit well in this sort of space, but they're important for kids, is we have a practice that's you're really using tactile experiences to support self-regulation. It's the one about going to the doctor, like doctors and medical dental therapy visits. And it relies on a child identifying objects or textures that help them self-soothe or calm. And so it's a practice where you help them explore and identify what those things would be by collecting various objects with different kinds of textures that are portable, and then working through, like, touching into that and finding the ones that elicit the sort of feeling that one wants to have, and then being able to take that and stroke that and use that in different places. And I was thinking about, again, the head against the carpet, and there's a particular feeling of the forehead against the carpet that is perhaps part of what soothes and focuses. Again, I think a lot of us have a kind of practice like this that we may not even be entirely aware of. It might be tactile in the sense that you like stroke your dress or shirt or whatever, or it may be more of a musical kind of tapping your fingers or toes or whatever, but many of us have something we do when we're feeling anxious that is similar to this. We do know from infant studies on forward that certain textures tend to elicit, again, certain kind of embodied experiences that help calm us. So just figuring out what that is. And again, being able to do that in a way that doesn't judge the choice, because we make assumptions that soft things are the things like really soft, furry stuff. If you go in any, Crate and Barrel or whatever, they're gonna have the really wonderful blankets and things like that, which I find personally very soothing. But for some children, it's gotta be something that's more knobby or bristly that stimulates that kind of sense of contact with something that a soft object won't do. So looking for something like that. And again, we attach this to what can be some of the very scariest experiences for almost any child, going to see someone who's gonna poke and prod and question and maybe, stick sharp things in them and all the stuff that they don't like. And then stimming, which is the repetitive activity that some children engage in, is often seen as a problematic behavior by many folks, but in reality, it is a kind of grounding tool. The child's already using that as a way to help them sort of see themselves in a space and recognize that. So again, building on that, we use this as in relation to running errands because they're less predictable than some other things, so they create a lot of anxiety for kids on the spectrum often. And so helping them recognize that their stimming is not a bad thing to do, even though they may get like negative feedback from people around them, not even always intentionally, just people look shocked or puzzled or annoyed at it because they don't know what it is and they don't understand it, is to help them see it as actually a tool that is helping them connect with themselves, a spiritually good thing to do. And so identifying and asking, but never forcing, if you can also try using their stimming process as a tool so that you can better understand how it works, and that you could use it with them or use it to cue them to feel comfortable to do it, and also so they're not having to do it alone, which could be helpful. So we used stimming around that running errands. And then we have the singing, music-based one, for separating from a loved one. Often for kids who are neurodiverse, it's difficult leaving those they love to go do whatever they have to do. Or if that person has to travel, or that person has to go off to work and they have to be, stay home, that separation anxiety can be very heightened there, in large part because that person's presence is part of their safe environment and their predictable environment. So creating a ritual using a song that you both can sing or recall in your head when you're apart from one another, and the child knows that you are using the song as well, is a way to make that connection feel more tangible, because the song becomes the tangible piece of connection. And so it can range anywhere from This Little Light of Mine, or another kind of worshipful song, to something like Baby Shark. Or Shake It Off, Taylor Swift's Shake It Off, especially if that's that kind of movement, ADHD kind of child who might like a more active, moving song. Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, Let It Be, whatever it is that the child, the family loves. And there's a whole process of sort of building that as your song. So you sing it together, then you practice just being in different rooms and both singing it, where you can still kind of hear or know it's right there before you ever then have it as something that you're using at a further distance. You can hum it if you're not a singer. You could listen to it if really the singing part isn't there, but the music itself is the cue. It could be on everybody's phone or recorded in a place that's accessible and just used in that way. But again, that sort of way of the connection becomes the song's the bridge in the connection, and could be used for a host of different ways. This could also be with a group, if that becomes an important part of a child's life, or if you just want to create this sense of connection to the Sunday school group or the youth group or whatever. Maybe your group has a song that becomes a way of recalling each other's presence, particularly if the child begins to find that group is one of their support spaces that helps them feel anchored in the world. There. Other ideas or comments or questions from you?
So I'm used to seeing, but I grew up going to a Catholic church as well. And I thought about rosary beads, because honestly, it's the original fidget. Like, because you would roll the rosary beads and do it, which you could just make that into something for a kid that could sit there in church with those. I made them as a fidget for a keychain, but I didn't think about putting them as a specific prayer, which would give them a habit of that, and help with stimming too, because you would be doing a repetitive motion if they spin or something.
Yeah, that's certainly, the tactileness of the rosary beads is a crucial part of that practice. Also, they're different sizes that help you know when you go from one piece of the recitation to another. They could be colored. And again, a child could create them. We have some other practices and some other resources that are about using color coding on the beads. And I know sometimes people have used that for like a Holy Week, how to remember the Holy Week story and make a bracelet with the colors. Again, so it's thinking about, for the child, one, is that sort of texture and practice something that fits with who they are? And then two, what ways can you do that help that elicit, cues certain kinds of behaviors. So it might be that just having textured kind of beads would provide that kind of feeling, and especially for a child who doesn't want others to notice too much, fidgeting with your bracelet of textured beads won't signal to everyone else that you're struggling. So that could be it. But for another child, it might be that the colors remind them of a social story, that you've cued. And so your social story has those colors on different pages or with different steps, and then now they see the colors, it helps them remember the story. So it would be thinking through how this could work. But, excellent idea. And again, if they're comfortable with something on, now that's the other thing, tactileness doesn't always mean they want to wear something, but it could be on a keychain or attached to a phone or a USB drive that's got a string that's really a beaded kind of piece, because again, that's, as some children become more aware of how other people are seeing them, they may not be able to place themselves in the other person's shoes, but they know how they feel when they get looks, or they know that they're uncomfortable when they get looks. They may not even be able to interpret what that is. So we also have to think about that piece.
Thank you. My question has to go into that a little bit. I think, I'm thinking of Sunday school classrooms that I've been a part of, and is there a way to have a social script for like a class? I feel like so often, other kids might notice Aaron's a little bit different. Aaron might have had, some disruptions before, and it can make it hard for the rest of the class to know the normal script of now how do we interact with Aaron. Do you have any suggestions, resources for that?
I do think that the idea of a social story that either might be shared by the class or might be tailored to the different ways that different children are responding to the other child's perceived difference. Because again, it might, for some children, the thing that feels different is the stimming activity. For another child, the thing that feels different is they're struggling with the fact that the child doesn't look them seems to be looking past them, and they keep thinking there's something behind them, and they don't know what to do with that. So it might not be that one story will work for the group, because the different responses that are trying to be interpreted aren't the same. But perhaps everybody creates a social story for something about what happens in group, and maybe it's not even centered on a particular child. It's what are the things that happen that I feel some discomfort with, and how could I prepare for them? And teaching children that social stories are a way that they can do that means that they can actually take that skill and use it all over the place. Let me look and see if we got anybody here. All right, let me then shift to our last slide, which is to say, we are here at the Hub to support all of you in the work that you are doing with children and families, and really all ages. And so we would love to support you in whatever ways you need. As I said before, if you'd like to take more than one copy of the Spiritual Practices for Neurospicy Kids, we're happy to have them all go and nothing go home with us, but we're also happy to send you quantities of these. If you have families that you want to share them with, if you have colleagues in other congregations or in other places that you want to distribute them to, just be in touch with us. And this address is also on those flyers that are on your table. But I also want to mention a couple of other resources that have related sort of things that might be helpful. I mentioned before the Trauma and Resiliency Workbook for families, and this teaches various skills to relate to trauma, things like the shift and stay, or to recognize, to be able to track emotions, and to know what your resources are, and to figure out your sets of resources, to ground yourself, to feel more grounded, to use gestures, movement, to connect with self, and then also some things that are called Help Now, that has to do with when none of those things feel like they're going to work, what are some like emergency actions. So you might find that these ideas, although not explicitly focused on neurodiversity, are actually the same sorts of skills that are being developed across many different arenas. This one comes from the community resiliency model, and so you could then bring this into play. And really, whether children are undergoing what I would call capital T trauma, children in general, I'd say people in general are all experiencing at least lowercase t trauma in the ways in which we live in these very divisive times, in the sorts of high expectation, anxiety, and stress that is generated by the competitiveness and high expectation settings of school districts, et cetera. Plus, the best way to deal with any kind of trauma is to already know some skills before the trauma happens. So if we assume, and I think we should, that all people are going to experience low levels of trauma, what I call little t or lowercase trauma, at various points in their lives, because things don't always go the way we expect them to go, and that many people will experience at a big T trauma, a loss, a big disappointment, a struggle, then preparing all people of all ages with skills for resiliency makes a lot of sense. So this, we ran out, this is my last copy, so if whoever gets to be first, who wants it can have it today, but the rest of you can email me and I will mail it to you. We have this one. And then in our No Trauma Bible Stories, we have one session that is particularly about neurodiversity. So this is another one where you might find that an interesting piece for what you're doing. We call it, what is this? Trying to remember what that one's called. Feeling upset when things go wrong, social emotional learning and neurodiversity. And the story there is Psalm 13. That we're using with that. But this one also, there's things about gender identity and expression, collective trauma. So again, in a related way, we're working on the same sorts of stuff. And all of these, again, are free for the asking, freely shipped. We also encourage you to check out our website. All of these spiritual practices are also individually posted on the website. So it's one way that easily to share them digitally is to just share the link to those posts. And if you do Neurospicy, it'll pop them all up when you search on the website. But we also post on Tuesdays and Thursdays new material. It's all social science research based and spiritual connected. We do things from Thursdays was on connecting with good questions. And talked about the difference between kind of superficial conversations from certain kinds of questions, like have you got your driver's license yet, to the better kinds of questions that actually evoke a deeper connection between kids and adults. The one before that was on the movie that came out. What was the name of the dog? Charlie the Wonder Dog. And it's just a way for parents to use a movie, we also do books, that is popular at the time as a springboard for spiritual conversations, or church school teachers, or whomever. So our website is a great resource. We've had it up now for 5 years, and there, if you think 2 posts a week for, let's say 50 of the 52 weeks, because we do just one between Christmas and New Year's and that. So let's say there's 100 posts a year, that's 500 posts, and going strong. So enjoy that. Also, talk to us about your ministry needs. I've given you my cell number because that's the best way to reach me. Or you can email through the Real Kids, Real Faith. And we'd love to hear your own ideas. We're always looking for people who have an idea that we can maybe develop into one of these sorts of resources. And we provide some support, a supportive structure, but also funds to do that. So if you do have an idea and you want to talk about it, I'm happy to hear that as well. Any last comments or questions? Okay. In that case, I am giving you back 12 minutes of your day where you can either get out ahead of the storm or take a little bit more breather. But thank you all so much, and I hope to hear from some of you about some ideas you have. Take care.